I can unmute now. That way I won't forget. And then
Perfect.
I will share my whole screen. And I will also shrink this and hide it.
Right.
And then can also 3 people enter. Maybe did we turn that back on? Nothing to just the is my it should be the same, just a different intro slide.
A different what?
Should be the same, but just a different intro slide.
That's probably what it is. Yeah, exactly. On your first slide right now? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just gonna see it.
Yep.
Whoops, this is now. Okay. Let's see if this works. Okay, now it works. Great.
Yeah, that's such a
All right.
Yeah.
There. Awesome. Wow.
Looks all good?
It looks good.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's sharing.
Yeah. Let me
That
I know.
And then Sue, are you gonna let people in from the waiting room or do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so I mean on Zoom?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean,
yeah.
I was like. I was like, where's this room? Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'll just keep, okay, I'm gonna move. I guess I can't. That's fine.
And
Okay.
then when after your presentation, if people have questions, we'll direct them to the ask questions in chat. So if you want to look at them, or I'd be happy if I see them, I can help you as well.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Do you need a run properly before? Okay.
I think I'm all good. Hey,
I'm annoying you.
no, take your time. Do all the intro.
You're right. I should look up.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sue, just let me know when I can get started. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the George Washington Corner Society for the History of Medicine at the beautiful Rochester building. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. My name is Christy Slavogan, and I'm an assistant professor of health humanities and bioethics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. I've taken over this season of the Corner Society from the wonderful McCall Ross, who I'm sure many of you know. She's a historian of medicine, MD, and the Charles E. and Dale L. Professor in Public Health and Policy. As usual, before we get started, I want to give a little bit of background on the Corner Society. So Dr. George Washington Corner was the first professor of anatomy at the University of Rochester Medical Center. And in 1934, he organized a medical history club to provide opportunities for students and for faculty to attend lectures and enjoy lively discussions on a range of topics in the history of medicine. And so today, the Corner Society continues this tradition of bringing stimulating speakers like Graham Lee to Rochester's physicians, students, scholars, and community members. Really an intersection with Rochester, the University of Rochester community. And I'm really grateful that these events can continue to take place thanks to the generous support of the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics, Paul M. Scheibe Center for Bioethics, and the Humanities Center at the University of Rochester. I also must thank all the dues-paying members of the Corner Society. If you're interested in becoming an official member or in making a donation, please do let me know. I'm always happy to have those conversations. I'd also like to thank Bob Riley and Larry Guttmacher for their steadfast support of the Corner Society. Bob's right there. And I'd like to thank Sue Layton here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine for her facilitation of everything. So this is our first Corner Society of this year, of 2025. Part of our program's topics have ranged from Scandinavian artist Edvard Munch's medicalized paintings to the history of poverty clinics and mental health clinics in 1980s LA's range. These talks always take place 6 a year here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine at 5:30 or later, with reception following. So if you'd like to put these upcoming talks, the March and April talks, on your calendar, we do have flyers up at the front there, and I can also put you on the Corner Society email list if you're not already on. So again, just talk to me. And while I have a captive audience, I of course have to plug the next event. On March 19th, Rochester's own Michael Healy, who some of you may have met at Corner Society events before. He's a third-year medical student who recently completed a PhD in the history of medicine. He'll be presenting a talk titled Metrics for Maladjustment, Psychobiology, Social Psychiatry, and the Development of Symptom Scales. I hope to see you there as well, March 19th. Now, finally, without any further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Lan Angela Lee is an assistant professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, with joint appointments in the East Asian Studies program and the Department of History, Science, and Technology. Lan is a historian of the body and a media producer, contributing to podcasts and exhibitions relating to acupuncture, to Buddhist medicine, and to metaphors in science and medicine. Lan's first book will be out from Johns Hopkins University Press in April, very soon. And it's titled Body Maps, Improvising Meridians and Nerves in Global Chinese Medicine. Now, we are very lucky to get to hear some of this work from this forthcoming book. And I have to say that we are all really in for a treat. Lan's talks, which I've heard several of, are phenomenal and super creative. So fun. And I'm really looking forward to it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lan Lee.
As you were talking, I realized I was quite parched. Yeah. Thank you so much. Is this time for people? Thank you so much, Christy, for inviting me. If you can't hear, just let me know. I'll be walking around a little bit. As Christy mentioned, my name is Lan Lee. I'm faculty at we went to grad school together. So as Christy mentioned, I'm faculty at Hopkins in the School of Medicine in the Department of History of Medicine. My areas of expertise are mostly border reading medicine. I also make films, and I also look at very old images and very recent images. And the title of my presentation today, if my clicker is working, let's see if it decides to work or not. Will it try this one more time? Yeah, it decides to not work sometimes, but it's totally fine. Okay, great. So the title of my talk today is Invisible Anatomy, Meridians and Math in Global Chinese Medicine. And as Christy mentioned, this is an introduction to my book, which is coming out in April on Tax Day. So you'll also see links to the book website with discount, so you can purchase the physical copy, but it's also open access. So the book itself is titled, this is not, oh, I think it's because of Zoom. I think it's because, yeah, I think it's as it's getting on Zoom. If there's a way to, manage that, that'd be great. Yeah, Yeah, we'll see. So my clicker may or may not work because we're also double casting, but body maps, improvising meridians and nerves in global Chinese medicine. The talk today is meant for people who are familiar with these images and also who have no clue what I'm talking about. Hopefully be able to get a sense of the different levels of analysis, historiography, and also some introduction to these scenographic texts. So I look at a lot of images, and you'll be seeing images as text, images as words. You'll also be seeing forms of representation as ribbons. So I'm going to be actively mapping out some of these paths for you in the room. And keep in mind that we're dealing with different forms of representation. So again, text, graphic images, non-art images, and also some reconstruction with ribbons that I have. So I'll need some volunteers, maybe 6. If you want to come up. I shall summon you soon. The way that I'm framing both the images and invisible anatomy is I'm thinking about these objects as forms of technologies of life. And the reason why I'm doing that is because a lot of medical practitioners, especially people working on Asian bodies and Asian sources, will tell you that these objects are technological. These invisible anatomies are technological, but they might not always know how to theorize it. So, so the way that this book starts is that it is a long history of hand-drawn images. Hand-drawn images are really important because these anatomies, they don't appear on a CT scan, they don't appear in MRI scans, they don't appear on X-rays, they don't appear if you use fluorescent dyes. They're always drawn by hand for thousands of years. And they're old technologies that represented invisible anatomy. And these technical images, they also have practical implications on what the body could do and what it did do through units of life. And I'll say more about that because we are going to count these numbers and measure things. Meridians as units of life and also flexible inches as units of life. But so this question of technologies, why am I calling this technologies of life? Most scholars, when they think about how technology is defined, they'll go to Marcel Mauss, who is a French sociologist, and he has a large collection of essays in which he defines technology as the study of techniques. So it's already a verb, it's an action. And techniques are traditional efficient acts. Mauss is writing between the two wars, and he is concerned with the crisis of humanity. And for him, he's thinking that techniques will save humanity. It's how we work together and how we work with our bodies that can enlist and create order. An American sociologist, Louis Mumford, is writing around the same time, and he's also thinking about techniques as objects and practices of civilization and for civilization. Again, these are people who are really concerned with the ends of humanity because of the Second and First World War. Heidegger, famously a Nazi, but also famously for writing questions concerning technology and other essays, he defines technology as human contrivances that move us towards modernity. Also really important in the field. But what's important is that for these scholars, and they might debate on what counts as modernity, for all of them, especially for Marcel Mauss, there should be no distinction between the human and the technical. And I think my clicker, okay, it's still working. There should be no distinction between the human and the technical. And Mauss also writes about techniques of the body, and he uses this to theorize how people might, for instance, use a toilet differently, sit in a chair differently, like how people are interacting with the world differently. But there should be no difference between the human and the technical, and even allows philosophers like Foucault to write about techniques of life, things that can improve your life and make you happier. And yet there's a tension. Even though there should be no distinction between the human and the technical, there's still a separation between the two, and it's very anthropocentric. All of these writers are concerned with questions related to civilization, the ends of civilization. They're concerned with capital. They're obviously concerned with war, the body is being obliterated. And they're also concerned with questions of modernity. How is it that these modern technologies are destroying us? And you can see this crisis of humanity in discourses of environmental disaster too. They're concerned with questions of industry and also efficiency. Is this attempt to make life more efficient also killing us? So very, very bright and cheery. So with all these questions in mind, how these scholars are defining technologies, it's incredibly important in the fields, especially for scholars of science and technology. And they don't always apply to the old objects that I deal with. Okay. So I mentioned that the hands-on images that I look at, the kinds of invisible anatomy that I look at are very, very old. We've been around for thousands of years. And my clicker is needing some help. And so one question that I'm asking is, what if we looked at histories of technology that didn't have to do with efficiency? So I'm walking through how I'm thinking about the way I approach these very old invisible anatomies. And we'll get into some etymology and also a little bit of textual analysis. So bear with me. And the way that I'm thinking about a history of technology without efficiency is I'm trying to find sources and stories from the period that my sources are from. So I mentioned that my sources are very old, and sometimes most does not apply. Marcel most doesn't apply to these very old sources. So I started looking to other old, they're not quite myths, there are stories that come from the 5th century BCE, so about 2,500 years ago. And there is an old story about technology. This is the era of Confucius. If some of you didn't really know when Confucius was born, it's around the 5th century BCE. He has many students in his time. One of the students is on vacation and he's going home. And the student who's a scholar, as he's walking home in the 5th century, he comes across a farmer. He sees this farmer using what's called a wung. This is a very large ceramic jar. And I think it's mostly used for storage, but he's carrying water with the wung from the well to water his crops, his rose crops. And the scholar tells the farmer, he says, you seem like you're struggling. I know of a device that's made of wood, and I can give you the design. It pumps the water. It's super easy to use, and you can water hundreds of crops a day. And the farmer looks at him and he laughs. Like, irrigation is a very developed technology at this point. But he says, where there's a cunning device, there is cunning action. Where there's cunning action, there's a cunning mind. This is what his teacher has told him. The farmer's teacher, not the scholar's teacher. He said, a cunning mind is not equipped for clarity. This lack of clarity agitates the spirit of life. An agitated spirit of life cannot contain the thought. So now maybe you're wondering, why is this farmer really a farmer? So he cannot contain the thought. He's doing something else. He's a part-time farmer. So he says, but he looks at the scholar and he's laughing. His face turns orange, the text tells us. He says, I know of this device and I am ashamed to use it. This is really interesting because the farmer is refusing. He's refusing to let this device dictate his gestures. He's refusing to let it dictate his cultivation of the dao. And he is telling you, I know this iPhone. Oh, I know this water pump. I'm not going to let it inhibit my own way of living. So it's for him, it's a technique of life. And so what can we take away from this story other than to not be too clever, other than other things that can maybe guide us in living a better life by refusing certain kinds of technologies? This is something I'm thinking through in an article I'm working on called Technologies of Life After Orientalism. But I was interested in this story because it is a story about refusal. And another reason why I was interested, I'm going to actually skip historiography, but another reason why I was interested in this story is because of this word that I have translated as cunning device. I'm not a scholar of translation in the sense that I use words methodologically, and I'll show you how I do that. I'm thinking through, I mentioned this is an old story, and this word is an old word. This word that I've translated as cunning device, cunning, I could have used other words. I could have said clever, convenient, busy, active, mechanical, operational, disengaged, unfocused, unstable. This word has many meanings. And device, maybe I could have used technique. But this is just to say that this word is an old word, either jixie in Mandarin or gehai in Cantonese. Cantonese is an older dialect than Mandarin. And what's interesting is that this is a material. It has a wood radical, not brass, not copper, not gold. And if you remember, if you listen closely, the scholar mentioned that I know of a wooden device. And maybe it's because wood is easier to manipulate. If we look at this word, this is actually a more recent way of writing this word, jixie. And the script style is known as kaishu, which is developed around the 7th and 10th century. It stabilizes. This is usually written on paper. But if we go back to the period, I mentioned this is the 5th century BCE, the script style, this older script style, looked more like this. known as zhuanfu because you would carve the text into stone so that it looks different. But what's so interesting was I looked back at this word for device. And it's so interesting because let's take away the wood radical. If you look at the image of text, you have hands on the bottom, reaching up to something that maybe is a weapon. Maybe some people said it's a weapon. And I would say maybe it's actually a really complicated device that a lot of people spend days and days sitting at. And this actually has a direct relationship with meridians, which I can say later in the Q&A. It's a fascinating connection. But it's already something that's reaching up. And if you transform this word into the contemporary version of a kaishu, weapon loom looks like this, the hand looks like this in a different version of a zhuanfu. This is the word for self. The kaishu is like that. And so for anyone who takes like a Chinese language class and they learn, my name is what? My name is blah, blah, blah. This is the self. And what does it mean? This is a self that's already in action. It's a self where technique and technology are already combined. It's both relational and it's objectified. And it could be used to aspire to contain the Tao, let's say, or it could be used to avoid a kind of device. So if I use this, if I'm trying to think about ancient Asian sources to theorize and to make sense of ancient Asian things, anatomies, we could maybe have a new definition of technology. That's totally fine. So, you'll just get previews all the time. Yeah. So we can say that technology is a study of techniques, and techniques involves the cultivation of self, and the self can be acts of moderation. This is a very Confucian term if you know anything about Confucianism. So technology is studies of techniques of self, and we can think about this maybe through the word for technology and self, but without separating the human domain from technical creations. They're already one. It is always about cultivating the self. And this is a different way of thinking about anthropocentrism. So another thing is that I know that in the title of the talk, I've mentioned that I work on global Chinese medicine, but Chinese medicine doesn't actually exist as a coherent term until the 20th century. Historically, it's a very diverse set of practices, and how you write about the history of East Asian medicine, East Asian anatomy, it gets into a lot of nationalist politics. And so the way that I'm thinking about Asia and how I write about old Asian objects is through thinking about scholarship that deals with Orientalism. And many scholars have talked about Edward Said's 1978 book, Orientalism, which is really famous and has influenced a lot of post-colonial scholarship. But they've also thought about what do we do after we have this term Orientalism. So Said, who is a Palestinian literary critic, he's not a historian, he makes a really provocative observation where he described that the relationship between the Occident and the Orient is a relationship of power, domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony. And he's writing about the question of Palestine, but also he's writing about the question of the Orient in a Europe where the Orient is so close. So it's Turkey, it's the Ottoman Empire. So he's writing about this in the 70s, late 70s, and this has affected historiography. It's affected fields and fields of people who are influenced by the politics of the Cold War, because that's what he's writing. It has a lot of implications on what people mean when they talk about the East, the imagination of the East. They're writing about concerns related to difference. How different is this invisible anatomy body? How different is it? How threatening could it be? And they're also concerned with questions of the nation after the colony, the post-colony. Orientalism gives rise to the whole field of subaltern studies. And a lot of scholars who are writing about even, for instance, Chinese medicine, not Korean medicine, not Kempo, not Thai medicine, not Tibetan medicine. They're interested in questions of nationalism. And in addition to nationalism, there are questions of modernity. When do we become modern if these anatomies are so old? Do we look to these ancient techniques to create new forms of healing? Do we do this kind of concept mining where we can just extract from the old to create more new things? And that is part of this anxiety of modernity. And maybe Orientalism is not just a fiction of the West, but maybe it's being co-produced by the East as well. So maybe we have these hybrid models. But at the heart of all of these different elements of Orientalism it's a politics of representation. And a lot of the aesthetics, I know that I'm showing you slides, but the way that I think about these objects, the way that I present these objects, the way that I make my films, I'm really conscious about the kinds of graphics I use and the way that I talk about them. So you'll see it in my form and in my analysis. I'm drawing on other literary critics like Ali Behdad, who is also a literary critic. He writes essays called After Orientalism, but he's also really interested in how people who have been defined as the East are also appropriating genres of Orientalism. And he writes about photography, but he offers scholars or urges scholars to undertake an open-ended mode of criticism to challenge the regime of truth that has produced and sustained binaries: East, West, South, other, modern, tradition, China, non-Chinese. So these binaries are very stark, they're very provocative. And how do we undertake an open-ended mode of criticism? There's other scholarship related to subaltern and Orientalism that I'll skip for now. For me, this question of representation is important, especially when it comes to Orientalism, because for me, what does it look like for East Asian history of science? And what it looks like is this very impressive multi-volume series called Science and Civilization in China. If you've ever heard, China is known for inventing the compass, paper, gunpowder, military boats, what else? It comes from this whole series, this narrative of invention. And it's attributed to Joseph Needham, who was an embryologist at Cambridge, and his longtime collaborator, Wu Guizhen, who was also a biochemist. And so what's interesting is that this series is famous for what's called the Needham question, the Liga Nanti for those who speak Chinese. And the Needham question is provocative. It's, did the scientific revolution happen in China? Or why did it not happen in China? If you are familiar with history of science, you'll know that in the 30s, the narrative of a scientific revolution gets developed in between the two world wars. It's a narrative that is created by historians. And you also have words like the Silk Roads being invented in the 1930s. So Needham asking this question, it's a new question for him because this term has only been around for about 20 years. So he's asking this question. And it is doing the work of perpetuating different kinds of binaries. For him, he's interested in questions of civilization. And he's trying to answer this question by saying, you know, there are things that are invented. He's answering this question, well, we see all these inventions being made in China, and yet there is no scientific revolution that we know of. But it's also perpetuating particular regimes of truth where he's only looking at these moments of invention. Because he's also famously, he's known to be surprised that the Chinese are inventive at all. For instance, Lu Guizhen was his student, and he was really surprised to see that Chinese students could handle biochemistry. Anyway, that's a different story. So not everyone who has contributed to this really impressive series, it's gone on. I'm not saying the ghost of Needham is writing, but there are many scholars who continue to contribute to the series. It's incredibly impressive. It's a really rich primary source, but not all of them buy into the Needham question. And one of them is Francesca Bray. If you're familiar with East Asia or East Asian scholarship, Francesca Bray is like a hero. She's also really, really nice. And she's not quite a grad student, but she contributes to the series. And she's contributing to this book on biotechnology and agriculture. She's really interested in rice cultivation. And she's also not trained necessarily as a historian. She's trained as an anthropologist. And she's reading Marcel Mauss. She's thinking about techniques of the body. She's thinking about how there is no division between skill, artifact, artifice. And so she's known for writing one of the most, foundational texts in technology and gender called Technology and Gender, Fabrics of Power in Late Imperial China. She writes about weaving, and she writes about the gendered spaces, and she's thinking about, again, thinking with Mauss, techniques of life. She's also edited one text that's deeply informative for my work, and you'll see this in a minute, but she's edited this text, graphics and text, in the production of technical knowledge in China. So she's looking at images. She's saying images are also a kind of technique, right? It's a kind of object. And specifically, she's looking at very old kinds of non-artistic images. This is called a tu. Sometimes they're made of text. Sometimes they're demonstrating weaving. Sometimes they're showing ways to divine. And this graphic genre is called a tool that we tend to use for any image, but historically, it is a special kind of graphic genre that is not an object of fine art. And there is a very rich tradition of very detailed artistic painting from the 10th century onward. And these are templates for action. They're also these technical images that expand the imagination. And I mentioned, again, they're very, very old, and they're relevant to me because invisible anatomy only lives in this graphic genre of a food. And you'll see that I mentioned they're handmade. Sometimes they're made on wood block print. Even now, if someone's drawing on a computer, it will be done by hand. It's always done by hand. And it always lives in these invisible lines. So this is incredibly provocative, and that gives rise to my book, Body Maps, where I'm looking at this graphic genre of the food. And specifically, I'm looking at how the persistence of these technical images articulated invisible anatomies, and these are objects of self that enact the different techniques. We're really and I'll get into that in this next half of the time. One thing that I found really interesting was when I was a grad student, historians of science are obsessed with images. How do you know something is true? How do you understand evidence? You articulate it through images. So I was reading a lot about images, and I realized that art history was a really great way of getting into images. And I was trying to connect histories of science with art history alongside a lot of texts engaging with healing in East Asia. And all of these books give context to something that you might have seen, which is acupuncture. I don't talk about acupuncture in this talk today, but it will help you have a sense of what it's based on. Acupuncture with these needles, it's important to also understand that these needles historically were never so thin, they were very thick. And they're not always made of metal, they're made of gold, stone, or bamboo. And that we can get into some of the ontological implications later. And it's also used alongside, so Zhenjiu is two practices. It's not just needles, it's also a really old practice of burning moxa, which is dried millwork, and it heats at a high temperature that your skin absorbs. And so between needling and heating, between these two practices, these old practices, you can, for instance, based on a 1950s text, you can treat many different kinds of things. Nasal congestion, whooping cough, asthma, pleurisy, gallstones, cholera. If anyone has cholera, there's a insomnia, beriberi, polyps, blood clotting, facial nerve palsy. And the interesting thing about all of the practices I just mentioned is that you can activate it through these paths, but you can also access these paths internally. When you take herbs, when you smell different kinds of incense, when you're meditating, visualizing choreography, you're imagining these paths, you can access them internally and externally, which is why this book does not necessarily talk about healing, it talks about the images. So what I'll do is I'll break down the front cover of the cover of the book, which is composed of different primary sources. And I mentioned that the book is comparing a long history of representing nerves with meridians. And what's interesting is that physiologists expressed anatomy through these different graphic genres. They're debating what these invisible structures could do based on where they appeared on the page. They're arguing about what these objects are on paper. And as they're mapping meridians as nerves or meridians and nerves, a lot of physiologists are underestimating the practical role of graphic genres. And if you go to a clinic, one thing people always say is that, if you're needling, if you're using acupuncture, just the needle, just the silver needle, you're needling at nerves. And that never quite made sense to me. And I have a background in neuroscience. I spent some time in a touch lab, in a mitochondrial lab. I was doing epidemiological research on peripheral neuropathy. And peripheral nerves fascinate me because they're so unstable. So I have that lab, that empirical encounter with nerves as well. But I'm always interested in how they appear on the page. Because graphic genres, they're like literary genres. They manifest what Wittgenstein has called life forms. These are ideological stereotypes. These are generic types. These are kind of, maybe you want to say platonic types, and they're meant to organize social action. They're meant to do something, right? And when I think about life forms, what I mean are cosmologies, not necessarily just the stars. What I mean by cosmology is that these are deep systems of relationship, of causation. How do you explain how something works? What is the math behind it? And again, numbers, we'll get to numbers later. And these cosmologies operate at different scales, from the page, to the body, and to the sky. And what's so interesting about understanding these cosmologies is that they require a lot of improvisation because, again, they are unseen, because they are invisible. And that's also important for these handmade inscriptions, whether they're on paper, on woodblock, on a copper plate. They always required different kinds of flourishes to invoke these complex cosmological objects that did specific things within a network of relationship, within a network of causal relationships. So I've mentioned improvisation a little bit, and I'll give you an example of what I mean when it comes to the history of nerves. So this image is from 1951. It's an illustration, a lithograph of nerves by this medical student, he is recruited to create a series of illustrations of anatomy, and he illustrates what he describes as intercostal nerves, inter between costal ribs. And he identifies 11 of these pairs, and he's trying to push to 12, because then that can pair with 12 meridians that you needle on. But in this period in the 20th century, intercostal nerves are sometimes 12 pairs, sometimes they're 31 pairs. They vary a lot. And as he's studying a lot of these earlier illustrations of intercostal nerves, he doesn't yet realize that these nerves are highly improvised. So one example is one of the first illustrations of intercostal nerves comes to us in 1663 by Thomas Willis, who was an anatomist. And he is really interested in nerves in the body and these intercostal nerves that is foundational for anatomists like Willis to identify human rationality, human emotions, and the soul. He's saying this lives in the intercostal nerves, but he's highly improvisatory in his illustrations. He's drawing twigs, he's drawing branches, he adds some words, and he does do a lot of dissection, but this image is not based on any of his dissections. But it's this image that gets copied over and over again. In 1678, Emile Bourdon, who is a French anatomist, he copies Willis's intercostal nerves, and he adds a bunch of letters. He gives it ontological reality by naming it, by saying 1 is different from 2, it's different from C, it's different from gamma, it's different from Venus, it's different from all these things. He's giving these names discrete, he's giving these parts discrete names. And this is just to say that a lot of these anatomists, as they're creating these images and as they're creating this imagination of nerves, none of it is empirical. They're making non-empirical leaps to join nervous anatomy with nervous expressions. I mean, Descartes does this too, as he's trying to make claims on the human mind. It's non-empirical. And nervous anatomy then came to ironically, stand in as an empirical basis for explaining all forms of human emotion, thought, and sensation. And we see this also in Japanese translations of nerves. People are ascribing all sorts of things to nerves and bone and blood. And what's also interesting is that as nerves take on a lot and as they're being reproduced, images are being reproduced, they remain unstable and unreliable objects of modernity. And you see this, like even in the labs that I was in, the touch labs I was in, as we are sectioning dorsal root ganglia and bat wings, we are trying to figure out what these structures are doing because they don't map onto the sensation that we're trying to map. Sensation and anatomy don't map on top of each other. So this is to say that nerves come to explain a lot. They explain so much, they almost explain everything, which means that they explain very, very little. So nerves become black box, and they're also used to explain away these paths that I'm calling meridians. They're explaining meridians as just nerves, and yet they fail. So why is that? So meridians, this image comes from a really prominent illustrator, photographer, physician, Latin, and he grows up with acupuncture moxibustion. His father is a moxibustionist. He has pain in his back, and he gets treated by his dad, and he realizes, oh my gosh, this practice is really important. Too bad the Chinese state has collapsed, and he goes to Japan. He goes to Tokyo, and he learns acupuncture moxibustion there. and he goes to the libraries in Japan. He finds all these books, and he's like, this is where I need to learn this practice. And it's also in Japan where he sees all of these images of invisible anatomy. And as he's trying to, he's illustrating these images, he's creating his own. And this is also some of his reproductions. He's also reproducing images from the 14th century. And he's reproducing images of people sitting with their shoes off, standing, lifting their robe to show you single full paths in the body. He also knows that these are full paths that change when you're sitting, when you're standing, when you're sleeping. I know it's getting warmer in this room, as maybe I was getting like warm, but like as your temperature rises, you needle closer to the surface of the skin. When you step outside, you get really cold, you needle deeper. And so he knows that these are paths that extend from the head to the hands. He knows that they extend from the head to the feet. And he knows that there are 14 discrete paths, 12 to 14 discrete paths. And there are these paths that I have described, or that I call meridians. I'm not saying that in the body they're meridians. I'm saying that on paper, they're meridians. They're used to represent paths known as jingmo and jingmai. And there are lots of different kinds of jingmo, jingmai. There's sunmai, and not all of these mai and luo are visualized, but on paper, when they appear as a line, that's when I call them meridians. So I'm not translating. I'm just saying this is my analytical space. So again, meridians are a metaphorical term to describe graphic representations of jingluo and jingmai. And it's this word, jing, I mentioned looms earlier. Jing is the same word for the warp on a loom. And there's a reason for that, which I can say later, but I won't say now. So these graphic genres, or these graphic objects, are showing the materiality and the invisibility of corporeal structures that shaped discussions of ontology and location. So again, materiality and invisibility. When you have physiologists in the 20th century trying to debate what these paths are, it really bothers them that you cannot see meridians. Because if you can't see it, then can it be material? Look at physicists. A lot of things that you can't see are material. So it's both, and it's not problematic. More importantly, meridians represented elastic objects that were measured in flexible units of distance that animated, expressed, and composed life. And these are elastic because the body is cartographic and it changes. It's big and it's small. And Chen En is reproducing these images of cartographic bodies in his texts. He shows, again, proportions of people facing up, facing down, you have an aerial view. And I'm gonna, 1 second, admit you, cool. So on the face, you have inscriptions saying that the distance between the ears is maybe 1 foot 3 inches. Don't bother with that just yet. The distance between the cheekbones is 7 inches. And then on the arms, this image tells you people range in size, so take measurements according to the body. Long and short inches vary from infants to the elderly. And what's important is also to understand that these numbers are discrete. So more importantly, he's referring to a unit called a twin. And for Chinese speakers, twin is just inch. It's not remarkable at all. Historically, twin referred to the size of a millet seed. And people would measure, you'd have mathematical calculations describing the distance from the earth to the sun in millet seed and twin. But for the purposes of the 7th century, it became standardized to the middle metatarsal or middle finger. It's inside. It's not the surface, it's inside of the finger. You'll see that you have a side view of the hand. And it's known as a same body inch in the 7th century. So this is interesting. I'll say like 1 twin, we'll call it maybe an inch. But 10 twin is we'll say that maybe this is a foot because it's 10. It almost sounds metric. And then 10 is a zhang. What's called maybe a megameter. And if you wanted to have a sense of like, I can measure maybe like a twin here, very tiny, my middle metatarsal. Maybe this is a sure. No. And if you wanted to get really precise, this would be a zhang. It's very, very long. And this is your maybe megameter. So maybe an inch, maybe a foot, maybe a megameter. But the most important thing is that they're all flexible, depending on the body. So this is to say that practitioners and illustrators, they understood that units of distance were relative, but they were also discrete. They have numbers or assigned numbers, non-arbitrary numbers. And they also reproduce these early modern sources that are representing the body as cartographic and cosmologically embedded. And what I mean by that is that when you look at images like this, you have Taoist trigrams, you have heaven and earth, you have the eyes appear, you have rivers and valleys. Like, this is a really hard image to read. And this image comes to us from around the 13th century. And it's, this is actually a Japanese hand copied manuscript. So I don't know the date of when it's copied, but the text is dated to the 13th century. And it's attributed to this one scholar called Wang Haohu. And he doesn't come from a family of physicians. He is living in a period of complete social destruction, the collapse of empires. He's running in between different kingdoms. And they're also, in the 13th century, 33 epidemics, so 33 COVIDs. And he is really upset that his peers, his physicians, they don't know how to treat people. And so he gives himself this name, Wang Haohu, lover of antiquity, to say that you have to look to the past. So even the 13th century wasn't old enough for him. He's looking to the first century. So he loves antiquity. So this image is hard to read. Usually you look to the text on the side. So we're going to do textual analysis. We're not going to look at the image right now. The text on the side tells you that you have paths from the hands, the head, to the feet, to the stomach, and it offers a correlation among heaven and earth. This text you see pretty conventionally, it gets repeated and copied over and over again. But then the text continues. And it tells you, very interestingly, that each path has discrete lengths. So we have lengths measured maybe in an inch, maybe in a foot, maybe in a megameter. And the paths have yin and yang pairs. They're also paths that move from the eyes to the feet. And you also have, if you ask me about my favorite meridian, we're gonna do my favorite meridians because it circles your body front to back. And it gives you, again, the discrete lengths. So what does that actually look like? Which is where I'll need a volunteer. Christy, if you can. So I measured these out with my own sweat. And I'll need people to maybe, let's see if you want to stand here. So you want to stand right in the middle. I have color-coded these yin and yang, 小麦, 热麦, 动麦, and I'll show you what I found. So yang hand meridians, I'm going to just use Chinese because I can't switch. 五指三丈 total. So this is a yang. So here are my yang. So we got two of those. Notice that there are 3 paths each. And then next we have yin meridians, 35寸, 2丈1指 total. So here are yin meridians. Yin meridians, thank you. And the yin meridians, we just have so the yin and yang. And then we have feet meridians, 8指 each, 4丈8指 total. So here we have feet. So sorry. So this is my, this is yang. And then we have yin, which is 6指5寸 each, and 3丈9指 total. This, okay. Cool. And then finally we have 2 qiao meridians from the feet to the eyes. This is going from the feet to the eyes. Maybe we'll split it. Weird, that was nice. Yeah. This. Thank you. And then finally, my favorite one on the torso, 任脉动脉9指 total. So this is quite short, and I will ask one person to maybe stand in this whole so we can see this full meridian set. So if you can hold this, thank you so much. So this is super interesting. Okay, so what did we see? What did we actually see? I know it's a little hard to see. But for those holding the hands, you might just looking up. What you'll see is that this is the hands. So those are the feet. This is down. Those are the feet. These are the hands. These are the hands. You have the hands. You'll notice that these are the feet. You'll notice that. So you'll notice is that these are quite long, right? They're much longer than my body. And the understanding was that meridians twist around. They're very long. They twist our body. And also you'll see that the yang paths are longer than the yin paths. Same with the feet. The yang is longer than the yin, and even though they only cost me. You see that the shell are also quite long. They're my this own thing. So hold there. They also have discrete numbers and discrete things. And you'll notice again you have yin with yang. Yin on the hands and the feet, the pink and the red. And these are the bone, that's what they're only discrete sets. There's another set of meridian paths called the auxiliary, the weird paths. Weird is my interpretation, but these are the standard. And so this is important. This is important because even though they're all discrete, the text goes on to tell you that all of these paths add up. So you can hold it down or put it down, and I feel like I'm on HGTV and I have this prepared. So I'm gonna just put you down, yeah, and over down. Thank you so much. And so it'll tell you that all these paths also add up. It's not so important to show you that, I mean, this relative, not to scale thing. So they add up to 1,620 all of the paths add up to a single unit. And every 2 steps curve results in 50 cycles. 13,500 breaths make a living person based on images of water. So what does this mean? What is this telling us? It's telling us that you have units of distance, but are also units of time. And units of time, because you have breath, are units of life. And this 13,500 breaths is important because what it's referring to is it's referring to an older text that tells you that as you inhale and as you exhale, you move the chi. You move the chi 3 inches. Inhale, you move 3 inches. Exhale, you move 3 inches. Inhale. So it's moving. So breaths are these important units of life. This number 13,500 breaths, this is where we get into a little bit of math. Thank you. Oh, sure. So 13,000, these numbers are not arbitrary. 13,500 breaths. 6 twin I mentioned, inhale, exhale, 3 twin. 1 breath is an inhale, exhale. 1,620 twin divided by 6 is 270 breaths. Inhale, exhale. 270 breaths times 50 cycles is 13,500 breaths. And this is not the primary source, it's my math, and I got it checked by my mom. It's a whole thing. But anyway, this is to say that these numbers are discrete, and I'll say more about why they're important. So water clocks. He also mentions water clocks because this is an 18th century image, but the water clocks are all measured by a ruler floating at the last tub. And this ruler, which is quite long, it's kind of again, because it's a tool, it's giving a rough idea of what it is. It extends into the water, and there are 100 of these units called a ke, 100 a day, and it's around 15 minutes. That's why you even today people will say, it's rather than 4:15, it's 15 minutes, a quarter of an hour, but it's really an older unit of 100 units a day, this ke. So he's saying 2 steps, that's why I've translated steps. So maybe for a living person, it's taking you 30 minutes, maybe, per breath. You can try it. I know people who, anyway, whatever. So he's concerned. I mentioned that there are like 30 pandemics happening in the 13th century. He's trying to say, well, actually, it's taking us longer to breathe. Maybe it's 1 hour per breath, because as we're getting more sick, our bodies are getting more stagnant. Maybe something is happening differently in our bodies. And he's actually quite anxious about this. He's not saying this is what will make you feel better, but he's engaging with this text with the understanding that there are very serious pathologies in the 13th century. And he's also producing images like this as the empire is falling. He's mapping because he has to run. He needs to know where he's going. But as we've done this whole exercise, this is just showing you how close reading of Meridian tool, this graphic genre, shows specific kinds of accuracy that are featuring discrete lengths, made of flexible units that are tethered to fixed quantities of time. And more importantly, these quantities of distance and breadth, they may have had numerological purpose, meaning, and implication. I told you numbers are going to be a little bit important. These numbers, 1,620, this length is supposed to be 1,620 twin, 13,500 breaths. It's interesting you see these numbers because they also all add up to 9. I mean, this is not, so also, but I mean, I was trying to cross-check this with a Taoist priest, and he was like, that's also why you have 316 meridian points, because 3 plus 6 is 9. 9 is it's a really important number because 9 is also the homophone for longevity. I mentioned you're trying to extend life, right? So these numbers are not arbitrary. And maybe we can think of Meridian tool as technological objects that are measuring other technological objects, these Jinghua and Jingmai. And they are moving life, and they're making life. And if you knew how to work with them, maybe extend life. So what does this mean? Unless you want to hold it, I'll move this here. So why does this matter? Why does this matter? This still matters. This matters for, if we go back to Wang Suitai, who is the young illustrator who illustrated nerves, he's looking at these texts. He's looking at these old texts from 1,000 years ago, from 500 years ago, and he's illustrating meridians. And he is saying that I don't want to illustrate them as fragments. I'm not going to illustrate them as nerves. Instead, he abandons all of this and he illustrates the yin and the yang paths as a continuous loop. He's illustrating them passing from the head to the hands to the feet, through the 12 organs, the 12 yin and yang organs. He's writing about the 5 elements. He's writing about the seasons. He's writing about how deep you should needle. He's writing about how these paths are changing the body, how they sink, how they rise with the temperature, if it's hot or if it's cold. And he illustrates all of these as a continuous loop. Yin here, again, pink and red, yin and yang. And this is an image that he publishes in 1966. There's a whole kind of political situation with the Cultural Revolution, and he's still publishing, even though he's not allowed to put his name on a lot of his papers. But he's dedicated to this. He's dedicated until he dies. So he dies in 2008. And when he's much older, this is his son dies, many things happen to him in his life. He's also working with the WHO to standardize names of acupuncture points, but he is editing a book like this, Illustrated Manual of Chinese Acupuncture Exhaustion. Again, Zhonghua Zhenjiu Tu. So he has this edited volume, and the first chapter that he starts with is that he invites someone to write a chapter on time, on cosmological time, on the elements, on trigrams, on different calendrical systems. The stars are important. And this singular unit of time, he then adds to a modified version of his meridian wheel. It's flipped now, but this is a single unit of life. And so this is just a way to think about the next time maybe you're getting needled, maybe you're going to a chiropractor, I don't know, maybe you're working with someone who does dry needling, but maybe you can now appreciate how grasping this discursive, political, and the ontological stakes of body maps requires many different methodological approaches. So math, history, reconstruction, critical cartography, Orientalism, to wrestle with these invisible structures that are very dynamic. They're dynamic technical objects. And finally, interrogating meridians as nerves through graphic genres further demonstrates why and how they have failed to meet. I can stop there. So there's I can stop there, but yeah, here's the this is the book. I maybe just 2 seconds. 2 seconds. So I did mention that I don't talk about healing in this book, but in my work as a filmmaker, I'm also working on a project with practitioners, and I've always been collaborating with practitioners This is moxa that's burning. And some of the second project is looking ahead to different kinds of objects, didactic objects that are associated with needling and heating, and our technologies for divination. This is an acupuncture ear. Ear acupuncture is famous for being invented in France and being imported into China and being made nationally and traditionally Chinese. But this was an ear that sat in the pocket of in a teenager's pocket she was also writing music. So she's writing music that she's writing when she's learning acupuncture and when she's doing forced labor in the countryside. And this is her instrument. And I'm trying to figure out how to write about these practices through different kinds of objects, musical instruments, music sheets, and also even spinning cosmological discs. These kinds of discs are still used by researchers in France who are trying to treat long COVID based on different political time, where depending on the time you're sick and various other populations, you needle particular points with needles with a pull. So that's what this is also used for. And just to say that hopefully this can allow us to think about invisible anatomy and meridians with a little bit more insight. You can look at the book here. There's a discount code, but thank you so much. And thank you.
Lana, that was incredible. Thank you so much for that really beautiful presentation. Really in a lot of ways. I'm happy to field questions.
Yeah, I will make this working.
Questions now. If folks in the audience raise their hand, I can pass the mic if it works. And I can also get some questions from Zoom.
I'm gonna ask you a really dumb question.
Oh no, there are no dumb questions.
But so metaphorically speaking, anyway, is it, maybe try to help me understand. When we're taking a breath and moving sheet, when we're sticking that to the needle or moving sheet, that sheet that goes through the meridian, that go like through the what? And so when we take the action, when we have the muscle, moving sheet like that.
That's not the question. It could be all of the above. Well, it's already to be machine muscle with moving muscle. It's not thinking about even anatomy, and then historically what kind of muscles is involved. It's not important. Only later do you have muscles strapped onto this impulse. In terms of what's being moved to the muscle impulse is it achieved? But again, I think one of the most funded NIH labs was a lab not looking necessarily at needles, but looking at package tissue to see how the package tissue wraps around the needle when it's inserted. So maybe it's not just theoretical comparison of the package tissue, but then you get into so many different morphologies and cell types. And even saying, so what do we need? Practitioners will tell you one thing, researchers will tell you another, patients will say something else. And they are all valid. And I mean, anthropologists might describe having multiple bodies and multiple geographies and languages, but they all serve it. So yes, maybe it's invisible in the video class. And if you talk to a woman as they're doing the site, they'll tell you that every time they insert the needle, the site of the person releases, maybe it's achieving. So it's doing something specific because they need it.
One follow-up. Did you mention that this campus and give the what is the gene mapping to even though we not have identified it yet in Western medicine. So this could be mapped and this could be certain meridians could be certain traits of what would be passed on from one person to another.
So some archaeologists, when they uncovered courses, will see as imprinted on the body. Some acupuncturists who look at these as recognized meridians will say that, well, maybe they manifest poorly in these mummies. The interesting thing with these particular paths is that you can't see them all at once. You can't see all the colors. And some researchers have tried to inject dyes along the path. It doesn't belong to have a little bit in. So the only way you see all the at once are in these black images. And nobody can tell you where they are because they already appear as a discrete set. So a lot of people argue about what they are, but we can't deny that there's things behind us.
Good questions. I had a question. Sorry, this mic is. I had a question about.
You mentioned at the very beginning, like how the also relates to Meridian, and could you talk a little bit more about that?
So
Tease.
yeah, I
want to know more about that.
so what's so interesting about I think so when most people interpret the word for me, they'll say at the top is a weapon, but my sense is that that translation comes from the 1930s when translators are reading Marx and Engels is saying that weapons make humanity. And I'm pretty sure that that translation is a stirred up. One reason why I would push for loom, not only does it kind of suggest something quite complicated, one reason why I push for looms, I mentioned that the word for meridian is the warp of a loom. And in the previous question, I mentioned that these objects are quite old. And archaeologists are not only exhuming corpses, they're also exhuming tombs where people are buried with objects. Some of these people are women weavers. They're buried with the loom, and they also bury with them the figurines with meridians on a wooden lacquer object. So, and we know that they're women weavers because of how the clips are kind of contorted to separately that are weaving for so long. So we don't know what the relationship is necessarily, like were they using them as a way of thinking about an extension of life? But also, could it also be that they understood this literally as an extension of themselves? And one other interesting element is that for those who are familiar with Tantra, the word Tantra in Sanskrit means the warp of life. So how is that weaving keeps on coming up over and over again? And I don't know if any of you are weavers in the room, if you sit, very complicated. It takes a long time to set up a loom with the shuttles and the heddles and all these things. So I would not be surprised if that was how they're thinking about their, I guess, embodiment practice. And again, the words are the same too. So that is very interesting.
Any other questions from the room or anything?
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I'm a little bit shy to ask this question because I'm imagining this all. You touched on some topics such as light, yin yang, Tao, and it made me wonder: does the meridians and the math behind it does this play any role in a bigger context of meaning of life, spirituality, and are there overlaps with things that we're seeing in other cultures, such as in India, especially when we're talking about things like space-time, and the units of measurements that we talk about, meridians, all of this. I just get the sense that there's a lot of overlaps.
I will answer that with a podcast that I produce. So if you get on Zoom, Black Barrel. So if you look up Black Barrel, I produce it with Pierce Alvaro, who is he's a practitioner, historian, and anthropologist of Asian medicine, that is birth-based medicine. And so in this podcast, we look exactly at this question. We look at the relationship to medicine, religion, and spirituality, the bodiness. We look at gender, we also look at practice, we look at possession. And we actually switched, the podcast used to be called Blue Barrel, which was the one to unite in Buddha. And we switched to Black because we did the dark side of meditation. So again, I mentioned possession, exorcisms, and one of the people we interviewed is our doubts, habits, they're co-habits, and they're like 22nd generation, and they will tell you that all of these members have meaning, and they'll also tell you that, I don't know if you caught this, but in one of the images, there are constellations. So even when you look at a map, like a disc like this, it gives you different units of time, but it also has names of constellations because, like the North Dipper, North Dipper, for instance, is a site of death, is a site of life, and when you're doing different methodographies, you can type in that constellation in the body. And I also, I mean, as someone, I'm not coming to this, I just happen to be interested in being medicine, I also practice. And it wasn't until we mentioned that, and I remembered that that was something that I had also done. So, meaning of life, I mean, maybe life is many things. I can't say, I'm not a priest. But in terms of practice, yeah, it's not arbitrary. But that's what I would and check out the podcast, you know, 'cause I just love them, so yeah. And
we will have time for, so we.
Apologies.
you're asking what everybody's thinking.
I have to put more of the practice. So you said that, you know, if I take a breath, then roughly I'm moving chi 3 cool. So, okay, then somebody, maybe I'm more efficient there, maybe I move it all faster to my practice, right? But to me, then that would say if I'm in a meditative state, what's the optimal time? How many breaths should I take? And how do I 13,500? Put it,
One breath, you know, so that is. Also, breathe, skin or your skin so that even when you're swimming. And sometimes more people practice whole body breathing, even if you like practice, you can breathe. Again, I read about getting out of the organ or like they're not that important. They do, but they are responsible for office movies and but for instance, the skin has your breathing and your neck and cold. That's how they breathe this as well.
Hey, thank you so much. Let's thank Lamb.